Alfred Marshall and the Theory of the Firm. Alfred Marshall was an English economist and the true founder of the neoclassical school of economics. His specialty was microeconomics, and although it was often extensions and refinements of the work of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill, he extended economics away from its classical focus on the market economy and instead popularized it as a study of human behavior. The Principles of Economics. Marshall is the author of Principles of Economics, published in 1890, which became the most widely read manual in microeconomics in Marshall's time. This book, which is his major work, established a radical change in how economics was taught. Marshall emphasized that the price and output of a good are determined by both supply and demand. The two curves are like scissor blades that intersect at equilibrium. Just as it requires both blades of the scissors to cut paper, both supply and demand are important in bringing prices into equilibrium. In other words, market prices do not make leaps, just as nature does not make leaps. Rather, prices move in accord with the interaction of the forces that determine both supply and demand. While the notions of demand and supply can be found in classical economics, Marshall, in his principles, was able to demonstrate with words and graphs how costs operating through the supply curve and utility, which operates through the demand curve, interact to determine a market price. Modern economists trying to understand why the price of goods changes will start by looking for factors that may have shifted supply or demand, an approach which they owe to Marshall. The last major theory that merits attention in any assessment of Marshall's principles is the theory of the firm. The theory of the firm consists of a number of economic theories that explain and predict the nature of the firm, company, or corporation, including its existence, behavior, structure, and relationship to the market. Neoclassical economics dominates mainstream economics today, so the theory of the firm and other theories associated with neoclassicism influences decision-making in a variety of areas, including resource allocation, production techniques, pricing adjustments, and the volume of production. Neoclassical economics is an approach to economics focusing on the determination of goods, outputs, and income distribution in markets through supply and demand. The neoclassical theory of the firm puts forth the idea that businesses aspire to produce at a level where their marginal costs are equal to their marginal benefit. According to this theory, at this point profits are maximized, and maximizing profits is the primary and central objective of all firms. Marshall understood and demonstrated that marginal analysis was an essential paradigm for understanding economic behavior. Accountants may look at averages, but the economic way of thinking is to look at the margin. The theory may be used to describe, among many other things, various market structures, regulation issues, strategic pricing, barriers to entry, economies of scale and scope, etc. For Marshall, as well as for other contributors to the formulation of neoclassical thought, analysis of the functioning of a market system began with the behavior of consumers and producers. Throughout the discussion, it was assumed that man acted rationally in pursuit of their own advantage. Consumers were held to seek maximum satisfaction. Similarly, suppliers of productive services were expected to seek maximum rewards. Time. Marshall also made time central to his theory of the firm. In the short run, some factors of production the firm uses are fixed, others are variable. In the long run, all factors become variable. Time also matters in the decision calculus of consumers. Time affects elasticity because over time the availability of substitutes may change. The theory of the firm works side by side with the theory of the consumer, which states that consumers seek to maximize their overall utility. In this case, utility refers to the perceived value a consumer places on a good or service, sometimes referred to as the level of happiness the customer experiences from the good or service. For example, when consumers purchase a good for 100 Rand, they expect to receive a minimum of 100 Rand in utility from the purchased good. It was Adam Smith who gave the discipline of economics its most iconic form using the example of a pin factory, which relates concepts of specialization, division of labor, and the efficiencies of mass production. In the writings of Marshall, there is no such iconic firm. However, there is instead the representative firm. The representative firm. In the second edition of his Principles of Economics, Marshall introduced the notion of the representative firm to answer the problem of constructing an industry supply curve which would show the quantity supplied by an industry for any price. For Marshall, the representative firm is a firm whose costs of production are equal to the industry supply price. The amount supplied depends on the cost each firm faces when producing a good or service. Marshall knew that even for a given industry, There were firms of many different sizes who would be able to access different levels of internal economies and thus be able to produce at different levels of costs. Marshall created the representative firm to abstract from idiosyncrasies of individual firms and the inexplicable change of industry supply. His fundamental purpose was to avoid needing to assume all firms were alike. He wanted to be able to describe a single industry equilibrium with a single market price without having to assume that all firms were producing in exactly the same manner. Marshall's representative firm is a reflection of many firms found in many markets. By the study of a representative firm, Marshall showed how to think about many firms, and from this inductive approach, think about how firms might function in many different markets. Marshall's representative firm is not any particular firm, nor is it all firms in general. Marshall's choice of terms is spot on. The firm is merely representatives. Marshall gave us the famous metaphor of an industry being like a forest. While it might appear unchanged if one considered as a whole, the individual trees that make it up are constantly changing. It was to reconcile his dynamic view of individual firms with the static view of industries that Marshall introduced the idea of the representative firm. The Marshallian representative firm relates how firms in general respond to changes in input costs, changes in demand, and changes due to the passage of time. Now looking further at supply and demand in the nature of two examples Marshall relates, demand and distribution. Demand. After Smith's 1776 publication on the Wealth of Nations, the field of economics developed rapidly and refinements were made to the supply and demand laws. In 1890, Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics developed a supply and demand curve that is still used to demonstrate the point at which the market is in equilibrium today. One of Marshall's most important contributions to microeconomics, in conjugation with the theory of the firm, is the concept of price elasticity of demand, which examines how price changes affect demand. According to Alfred Marshall, elasticity of demand may be defined as the percentage change in quantity demanded to the percentage change in price. Different commodities have different price elasticities. Some commodities have more elastic demand, while others have relative elastic demand. Basically, the price elasticity of demand ranges from 0 to infinity. It can be equal to 0, less than 1, or greater than 0. Marshall evolved the total expenditure method to measure the price elasticity of demand. According to this method, elasticity of demand can be measured by considering the change in price and the subsequent change in the total quantity of goods purchased and the total amount of money spent on it. In theory, people buy less of a particular product if the price increases, but Marshall noted that in real life this behavior was not always true. The prices of some goods can increase without reducing demand, which means their prices are inelastic. Inelastic goods tend to include items such as medication or food that consumers deem crucial to daily life. Marshall argued that supply and demand, cost of production, and price elasticity all work together. To Marshall, the theory of distribution is essentially a theory of factor pricing. Like all other commodities, the pricing of productive services has two aspects, supply and demand. The demand for a factor of production is derived demand and depends on its marginal productivity. A producer employs more and more of factors of production till its reward is equal to its marginal productivity. Marshall's theory of distribution was essentially marginal productivity theory of distribution. For Marshall and his neoclassical contemporaries, the analysis of distribution was essentially a problem in the pricing of productive services. Its solution was sought along lines comparable to those followed in explaining the pricing of products. In the case of both inputs and outputs, the interaction of supply and demand established equilibrium prices. This approach was built around a threefold classification of the basic productive factors, land, labor, and capital, to each of which was assigned a unique distributive share. In the scheme of things, wages were defined as the reward for human effort. This definition, unlike the classical one, did not restrict wage payments to a working class. Once these distributional categories had been defined, supply and demand forces in the market could be appealed to as the basis on which rewards to the suppliers of productive services were established. It was, of course, recognized that each of the markets in which productive factors were priced had special properties. The labor force, for example, was highly differentiated by varying skills and abilities. The market, however, could usually be relied upon to recognize differences in the productive contribution of various types of labor and to establish appropriate wage differentials. The 19th century political economy ended, and the new economics began with Marshall's pioneering use of econometrics, his creation of economics as a rigorous discipline with its own content and method, his attempt to unify competitive economic theories and practices, and his belief in the evolutionary nature of economic knowledge. Marshall's overweening influences led two generations of economists in Britain and America to spend their professional lives discussing, restating, developing, interpreting, altering, and questioning his doctrines and tools of analysis.